that's the thing. Israel is not our homeland. I'm Jewish.
Yeah.
My family is from Russia, and we were.
And where did they come from before Russia?
They were from Russia. They probably were converted to Judaism.
So we were just on this campus and we ran into two Jewish girls, and they had these pamphlets that says Israel's an apartheid state and that anti-Zionism is anti-racism. And we have a sign here that says anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, right? So I tried to speak with them to try and discuss like what they were actually trying to preach, and they said
it's a form of Jewish nationalism, and it's been used to create the state of Israel, which is an apartheid state. Because we've seen Zionism be a force of destruction, especially given the state of Palestine and how Israel has been used in military campaigns across the world.
Is there a form in Jewish aspirations and their self-determination that have to do with like them going and living in their homeland?
But that's the thing. Israel is not our homeland. I'm Jewish.
Yeah.
My family is from Russia, and we were.
And where did they come from before Russia?
They were from Russia. They probably were converted to Judaism through other ways, but they're not from. I don't believe that Israel is occupying Palestine, and people were living in Palestine before Israel was created, right?
Yeah, they were living in a British mandate.
Yes, but those people were there living their lives,
Yeah.
and now they've been forced off their lands because of someone else's atrocity. And yes, like that needs to be reconciled, but it doesn't mean us like forcing that same situation on someone else.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, so let me tell you like my perspective.
Sure.
I'm completely against Palestinian suffering, not having equal rights, not having the right to resources, not having the right to movement, and all that comes with it, right? Like for example, I'm sure you heard of Deir Yassin, right, which is the massacre of a Palestinian village in 1948. Like, things like that are horrendous. I condemn it. I think it's horrible, and the only way for people to move forward on the land is for Israelis to realize that there is no future without Palestinians. And I think for Palestinians to realize that there are no future without Israelis, because neither population is just going to disappear. However, Zionism for the Jews that do live there, right, is the idea that they have a right to come back to their homeland. The minority of Jews did convert into Judaism, but the way like a people are associated to a land is not by the individual, but by a collective. And so it's a fact that the collective, the vast majority of Jews, my family being from Morocco, right, and my dad's family, my mom's family from Morocco, my dad's family from Poland, both sides of the family descend from Judeans, and that's why we are called Jews, right? Because we came from a country at that time called Judea. So yes, I'm sure there have been Jews that have intermarried, that converted, but they intermarried into a culture that the majority of them are native to the land of Judea. Now, it's very important, as you mentioned, that we shouldn't associate the right for one people to come there with like now we have to displace another people or take away their land. Right, so I think that the very problem of the conflict that we live in today really started with the British, where they said, well, one land has to be for the Jews and one piece of land has to be for the Arabs, and I think that's where it started, where we saw it as like one versus the other. Whereas what should have happened is the Jews should have been allowed to come back to their homeland, of course, not taking away land from anybody else, but living in land that was free, because there's still a lot of open land today in Israel and in the West Bank. And we should have tried to find a solution to live together with the terms that we set. However, that's not the reality, because Jews in 1948, right, came out of the Holocaust, and the Jews living in Arab countries were kicked out from their lands, and they had no place to go, so they had to create a country right away, a country that I think should have been created differently than it was, right? But we had no other choice to create it, and all the Arab armies around attacked Israel.
I don't think that was the only choice. Like Israel already exists and has done the things it's done, and
the Palestinian Authority also has done the things it's done. It's not like one side is completely wrong and the other side is completely right.
But the Palestinian,
right? We're all humans. We're all humans, and we've all suffered. And yes, today is
do have more power.
Absolutely. And I think Israel has more responsibility to change the current status quo than the Palestinians. I think those are things that we would agree on. But I think that the very fact that, like, for me as a Zionist, right, that is not against Palestinians, that doesn't say Palestinians aren't people, that wants Palestinians to one day achieve their self-determination, to say that the movement is anti-Zionism, it causes for me not to even have a place in the conversation, right? And if we really want to actually impact the people on the ground, I live in Israel, right? It's the Israelis and Palestinians that are going to have to come together. And if we picture the story as like, it's either you or you, and my movement of liberation means your movement of destruction and vice versa, that's how the conflict continues. Because today to be pro-Palestinian, it means you must be anti-Israel. And people assume that if you're pro-Israel, you must be anti-Palestinian. But how are we going to change and actually have peace for our children if we always see each other as the antagonists of each other's story? Both peoples are peoples. I think it's more a war with governments. I don't think the Israeli government that's right-wing necessarily wants to change the reality for the Palestinians, right? Because the way that they get elected is because they're strong on security, and in order to get elected and to have the population want to have a strong security, they have to have a conflict. So they don't want to change the conflict. And the Palestinian Authority, a lot of Palestinians see them as like a puppet of Israel that are really profiting from this conflict and making a lot of money in their pockets. So the solution isn't going to come from the politicians or the leaders, it's going to come from the people on the ground up. However, if we're not able to take a Palestinian activist, let's say on this campus, and a Jewish activist that's living in Israel on this campus, and get them to speak together, and not speak already in terms of like, oh, you're a Zionist, I can't speak to you, it means you're destructing my people. It's like, no, well, what I mean by Zionism is that I have a right to exist, and my people have a right to live in that land. And what you want, I am not against. So how do we actually move forward if we can't even start in that conversation that we're both human beings and we need to actually see what one another wants? So the only reason I'm bringing it up, obviously you guys, freedom of speech, right to express, right to give out whatever flyer, but as a fellow Jew, right, and a Zionist, right, I'm just explaining, telling you, you can disagree with me all you want, that this doesn't give me a space. And I am part of a generation that is Israeli, that is Zionist, and that wants to change the reality of the Palestinians over there. And when there's a movement that's saying like, this is about, we're against Zionism, it doesn't even allow me to have a space to communicate. In the end of the day, like, we have a role to play to try and change the reality on the ground. And if we prevent ourselves from actually being able to communicate with one another in order to move forward, then we're actually really the fuel to the conflict.
So, if that is your stance, I have not seen that from y'all, and I think that's incredibly important. If that is your stance, you have to show up. You can't just you can't say this in a conversation where, you know. So we have reasons to not trust you, right? And so I think until y'all have proven yourselves, we can't have a conversation.
Right, but be aware that it's also both ways. That a lot of Zionists like me have experiences with people that are anti-Zionist, that don't speak about Palestinian suffering when it's in Syria, when it's in Lebanon, when it's in Jordan. They only talk about legitimate Palestinian suffering only when it has to do with Israel. So to a lot of us, it makes us feel like, yes, you claim to support Palestinians, but only when it comes to the context of it having to do with Israel. So you actually want to keep Palestinians suffering, and I don't think that's what you're necessarily doing, right? The reaction
but that's
is
not
like
the point. That's not the point of what I was saying. Like, I feel like you're
right,
still
but
doing.
no, I'm just saying like vice versa. There's both of those experiences from both sides.
Okay, for sure.
When I try and press them on like, what about Jewish rights? It's always like, no, because Jewish rights automatically is associated to like Palestinian suffering. And I said, well, the fact that Jews have a right to live there, right, has nothing to do with the reality that happened on the ground. And you're completely taking out the responsibility that the Palestinian leadership, then called the Arab leadership, right, and the Arab leaders around in the area had in playing a role in trying to create a conflict. And I try to make them understand that me as a Zionist, right, and when I say Zionism, it's not what they think is Zionism, it's just the Jews having a right to self-determine, nothing having to do with the Palestinians. When I am a Zionist and I come and I see a message like this, I don't have a space to actually communicate with them because they're telling my very identity and the will to try and help my people have self-determination is inherently evil, and I'm inherently an evil person. And what that causes is, if you actually want to have peoples on the ground come together, the first thing you do is not label the other as inhuman. Because when you label the other as inhuman, you can't even start a conversation to try and find a solution, right? A solution is something that comes way after the conversation starts, but what they're doing is preventing the conversation from even happening.